So today we are going to talk about the arts and crafts. This is a design reform movement. Ruskin, who, I don't know if you're reading some of him in my class next year. For those of you who will be in it in the fall, you will read some excerpts from John Ruskin. He's an English writer in the 19th century. And in order to really understand kind of where the arts and crafts movement comes from, you have to think about where Ruskin and some of these other designers are coming from. So we're talking about mid-19th century England. What does that mean? It means England is industrializing really rapidly during this period, probably faster than any other place on the globe. So this, in some ways, is very good. England leads in terms of technological innovations, right? But that also means that they are the first to experience the downside to modernity, to industrialization. And so the backlash against modernity is strongest in England at this moment. And Ruskin is one of those writers who's horrified by what he sees happening. So he's looking around, he's seeing tenements, rapid urbanization, he's seeing the exploitation of workers in new factories that are opening. He's appalled by the worship of money that he sees unfolding with industrialization, by machine production, and by factory life. And so Ruskin and others like him look for a different model. If you're not going to embrace technology and industrialization, what do you suggest is a better way to live, right? So he looks back at medieval times. And this is kind of fitting, right? Because we have the medieval fair this weekend you can all go to and sort of imagine you're John Ruskin. This might be heaven for you. So he thinks that the medieval period offers a better cultural model, meaning this is a better way for people to live together in harmony. And that the architecture that arose out of the medieval period, as well as out of other healthy cultures and societies, is good architecture. So good architecture comes from healthy cultures, if you will. And it's produced by good and moral craftsmen. And there is very much an underpinning of morality to what Ruskin is talking about. And so he's saying we should reject industrialization, and instead we should look back to medieval times and embrace craft and ornament. And decoration for Ruskin is really what makes a building architecture. So it's that human touch, that extra added bit of something that is going to appeal to your eye and to your spirit. So in that sense, he's building on some of the trends that you may have talked about from the 18th century in England, like the picturesque, right? That architecture should sort of appeal to your emotional side, not be strictly rational. But he's grounding his argument in the spirit of the place. So what that means is nature. And this is important because if you looked at 18th century architecture in England, you may have seen architects imitating classical antiquity or even other buildings, right? Ruskin isn't interested in that. He's interested in look around at what's here, what's specific to our place and time, and take inspiration from it. So part of his argument is that if you look at, I'll leave it there. If you look at, this is on automatically, okay, let me turn off that function. But I don't want it to go forward. I think it's when you press the play button. Okay. So as long as I don't press play, I'm good. I'm assuming. No, I'm moving it back. Okay. I want to stick with that part. Okay. All right, so his argument is grounded in nature. This is the source of his authority, right? So he's saying if we look at nature, if you go to, say, Northern Africa, and you look at the way they build there, it is derived from the materials, from the climate, that the local traditions of a place grow out of the conditions of that specific geographic locale. And so, for example, he compares, the different animals that you find in different parts of the world, the different ways that people live in different parts of the world. And that's his argument for why, in England, he says, we should not be, imitating classical architecture. It has no place here. Instead, what is particularly English to Ruskin is Gothic. And Gothic architecture has a long history in England, so that kind of makes sense. And he talks about people and how they're different. So he talks about the Goths, from which Gothic architecture derives its name, saying, quote, their buildings together exhibited a degree of sternness and rudeness, which in contradistinction to the character of southern and eastern nations appeared like a perpetual reflection of the contrast between the Goth and the Roman in their first encounter. So what is he arguing there? He's basically saying that just as Gothic people and Roman people are different and their cultures are different, so too should their architecture be different. And he cites climate and agriculture. He goes into a long description of the different animals and trees and plants and all of these things. He says, for example, contrast the Arabian horse with the Shetland, the tiger and leopard with the wolf and bear, the antelope with the elk, the bird of paradise with the osprey, end quote. So he's using his observations of nature to provide support for his argument that Gothic architecture is not better or worse than classical architecture. It's just more appropriate for where he is, right? So it kind of makes you wonder, what would he think of our Prairie Gothic here at OU? I'm not totally sure if his argument would stand that that's exactly what we should be building in this climate, but who knows? The key to remember is that he's connecting architecture to local culture and to morality, and his argument is growing out of his frustrations with industrialization. So he's looking to nature and to medieval guilds, right? So, English arts and crafts here. Some of the key ideas, which you have these slides. It is a reform movement. It is looking to pre-industrial societies as a model. What this means in terms of architecture is that the order is rarely imposed on the designs. It is, as it says here, promotes intelligent space planning, allowances for human needs, harmony with the environment. So that is, you can think of that as very different from classical architecture. And it's derived in some ways or inspired by vernacular traditions, medieval architecture, Gothic architecture, Japanese architecture, and other sources. And the individualism of the designer is important to these guys because they are seeking to express something of their own approach and identity. Okay. So here's some of the key concepts. This is a social reform movement. So they actually do have these sort of lofty utopian ideals that they're going to change the way people live, that they're going to sort of turn back the clock on modernity and fix all of the problems, the pollution, the overcrowding, the urbanization, the poverty that they see in cities like London in the mid-19th century. That if we can just get these people back to their small villages, making handcrafted goods again will fix all those problems. It's very idealistic and not at all, as we find, realistic. So Ruskin is one of the main thinkers. Pugin is another. And I want to talk about him a little bit as well, because he's an important figure. So Pugin had a kind of tragic life. He was twice widowed, and then he committed suicide at the age of 40. So he didn't live very long, but he had a big influence. His father, Pugin's father, was a French architect who worked for John Nash on the Brighton Pavilion. Did you guys look at that building? No? It's a crazy, exotic-looking building in Brighton. And then his dad was responsible for publishing a manual of architectural details, of Gothic architecture specifically. So imagine your dad is spending his whole life drawing up Gothic architectural details. And maybe as a kid you get to help out a little bit on those. And Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who we're just going to call Pugin, does get to help out on these And then he builds on that experience and he goes on to write his own really highly influential theory of design, which he publishes Contrasts in 1835, and then The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture in 1843. And in Pugin's writings, he brings together a few main influences: his Catholic faith, rationalism, which he learns from his dad, who is a French architect, right? A personal sort of romantic approach to design, and a desire to use architecture as a form of escape. So where does that get you? Well, he sort of brings this together around one main concept, which is the search for truth in architecture, in design. And for Pugin, he sees things as sort of black and white, like architecture and design either embodies truth or it doesn't. And for him, in England, truth can be found in Gothic architecture. So what does that truth look like? The Gothic has this long history of it in England, and Pugin sought to revive England's lost past by reviving the Gothic style. So like Ruskin, he's advocating going backwards in order to move forwards, right? In order to get everyone into a better situation, we need to look to the past. And he does so in tandem with the call for functionalism. So this is where that simple planning principles comes into play. Pugin is not advocating for a lot of unnecessary spaces. He's advocating for something of an organic approach to design, where the building grows out of the functions it's designed to serve. And that function really drives the plan, but it doesn't mean that a plan will end up symmetrical. It usually ends up in a picturesque composition. Okay, and we're going to come back to Morris in a few minutes. So he's the third sort of, where are these ideas coming from, guy. And so individuality of designer, yes. Freedom in design, concern for delight in materials. We'll see that very evident in the work we're going to look at. Progressive in concern for the worker, but looks back to a pre-industrial path. So that's very much that sort of concern for what they see in London and other cities in England at this time with industrialization, overcrowding, and pollution. I mean, the pollution is terrible at this time. So we sort of romanticize places like London today. It would not have been so nice and tourist-friendly in the mid-19th century. Notice this, does not reform design-industry relationship. We'll get into that in the fall, some of you. But this is important. What that means is that because they're advocating craft, they're not suggesting that they could use the new tools that industry provides in order to provide more economically for the masses, right? They're saying, no, we want those masses to go back to the village, go back to carving by hand. So it's very idealistic, right? And they largely reject the machine in favor of handmade goods, and that leads to the biggest problem of all for these utopian thinkers, which is that no one can really afford this way of life that they're advocating, except for some of them. Like Morris has a very nice house, as we'll see. Okay, so William Morris. This is a tapestry executed by his company. Morris, like Pugin and Ruskin, rejects industrial production. He said, quote, "Production by machinery is altogether evil," end quote. So notice the moral connotations. This is really a battle between good and evil for these guys. They take it very seriously. He doesn't say production by the machine is ugly. He says evil. And that sort of makes sense if you put yourself in their shoes, where you look around at what's happening and you can trace all the ills of modern society, all the problems to industrial production. Overcrowding, the destruction of village life, of centuries of tradition, and of agricultural-based lifestyles, right? The mid-19th century in England, this is really when we're seeing fewer and fewer people engaged in farming and in craft, and instead instead moving to the big city and working in the factories. Morris was a socialist. He looked at what was happening and he saw it as this greed-inspired quest for efficiency and more money. And this is also the period of Dickens, right? So remember Scrooge, this is what we're talking about. That same era. And so Morris, like Ruskin and Pugin, looks to the medieval for inspiration. And he looks to the process of making things by hand, which he associates with morality, right? According to Morris, art was, quote, the expression of man of his pleasure in labor, end quote. So you could not have something that would be art in Morris's mind if it were industrially produced. That's just impossible. Because it's about like creating something, crafting it with your own hand, using your own labor. And so he wants to restore dignity to the act of making things by getting people to make things by hand. And it's really Morris who develops this philosophy that's built on Ruskin and Pugin into the arts and crafts style, what we know as it. Like Ruskin, he also stresses regionalism, which is that connection to place, right? So that whatever you do in England should be different than what you do in Barcelona or in Paris. Like each place should have its own stylistic identity. So, characteristics and motifs of arts and crafts design. So there is a unity in these designs. It's not total, but you will see that the architecture, the interiors, the textile designs, light fixtures, furniture, all of these things are often designed by one person. So they run the entire scale of design in many of the arts and crafts projects. There are two kind of leading trends, but there's a lot of others that we'll talk about. So rural vernacular traditions as a source of inspiration, which is that regional thing, right? And then medieval or Renaissance designs. Occasionally you'll see arts and crafts designs, because they vary so much, as simple, straightforward, lack of ornamentation. At other times you will see a lot of ornamentation, and we call all of that arts and crafts. So there is kind of a wide variety. And you'll see a lot of natural motifs. So sunflowers, lilies, birds, Gothic details, all of that will come into play. Okay, in the architecture, it really depends on who the architect is, what you end up with. So some architects design sort of organic, Gothic-inspired designs. Some are more geometric and rational and regular. And it can all be sort of under the umbrella of arts and crafts. Mostly country houses, that's what you see a lot of in the arts and crafts style. And they, notice this, that concept of the picturesque surfaces in these country houses, in that they don't look like they were built and designed at one moment. They look like they grew out of the site and maybe were added on to over time. So there's this organic, picturesque sensibility to these designs, and a strong connection to their site and local context. Natural building materials are used. You see a lot of texture, color, harmony with nature, especially on the interiors. Let's see. Let's look at some of this. Okay, here's an example. This is the Red House, and it is Morris's house. So Philip Webb is the architect. He designs it for Morris, and Morris does some of the interiors here. And this gives us a good indication of kind of arts and crafts. What is Morris advocating, right? So take a close look at it. It's red brick, so a local traditional material in England. Highly sloped roofs, which tells you you're in a northern climate, right? You wouldn't see these in the south of Spain, right? You just don't see roofs like that. You don't have any snow to worry about. There's no reason to build roofs like that. You also have dormer windows in some places, though it doesn't look like on this slide. And you can see immediately that sense of the picturesque organic sensibility. that it's not symmetrical. It doesn't look overly designed, if you will. It looks like maybe this part of the house was standing, and this could have been added onto later, right? That's where you're not totally sure if it's designed and built all at one time or if it's something that grew over a period of time. It definitely draws on medieval precedents, but it's not a historical revival. And that's important to understand, because what architects like Pugin were doing was more of a historical revival. So Morris really defines, the beginning of the arts and crafts, because you don't look at this and go, oh, that's a medieval house. You know that it's not a medieval house. It's not pretending to be something that it's not, even though it's inspired by medieval architecture. Does that make sense? Like, there's a clear difference there, I think. Let's take another look. This is kind of the back of the house. So you can see it's pretty irregular in the plan. It has these two wings that jut out, and then it has this, kind of joining volume here, and then this little well piece with a cone-shaped roof there. And notice the windows here. So there's three circles there, there's a pair of these, there's one of these, maybe this is a matching one, but that must be a stair because it's not lined up. And the same thing on the front, so you have a pair, three of these kind, one here. Each area has its own expression in terms of the windows that correspond to something that's probably going on the interior, right? Like the reason these step is because that's probably a stair. These are smaller because that's probably a private space. These two are probably going into one room, right? So the exterior of the building is beginning to tell you functionally what's happening on the interior. So that's very different from, say, Villa Rotunda, right? A classical building where all the windows are the same, they all march along in order, and you have no idea what's happening on the inside. And that's where, when we talk about arts and crafts being inspired by function, this is where that shows up. Because each volume of the building is designed to serve a function, and those functions are expressed differently by different windows, by seemingly random chimney placement. The functions of the interior really drive the expression on the exterior. Notice too, there's very little ornament here. And look at the way the building sits on the site. Did you look at Chiswick House? It was raised up on a podium. So some earlier upper-class British houses would have been raised up on a podium to lift them off of the ground. This one is very much connected to the ground. So that sort of desire to embrace nature and to sort of be one with it is reflected in the way the building meets the ground. It's really engaged with the site, and it's got all this dense, beautiful planting around. And it's almost as if the landscape is a kind of ornament in and of itself in some of these projects. Let's take a look at the plans here. So here you can really begin to see the way the plans are derived from function, right? Rather than some imposed sense of order. So the rooms are the sizes and the shapes that they need to be in order to accommodate the people using them, as opposed to sort of just some order imposed on them. And that is what gives us this sort of informal, picturesque character on the outside. That asymmetry is derived from functional needs, and that sort of random collection of volumes which together form the house. Let's take a look inside here. So this is the stair. The furniture here has traditional English craftsmanship and detailing. The wallpaper is inspired by nature. And I don't know if we have more Morris textile designs coming up. I think we do. But he's known for these really organic, but regular. There is order within his organic designs. And he's known for these, particularly in wallpaper and textiles. Notice that this room is not grand. It's not a monumental stair. It's comfortable for sure, but it's not going to overwhelm you with grandiosity. And of course, it makes sense that he's using traditional English craftsmanship in the details for the furniture, because that's a way of connecting to the specific place where he is working and living. And so this is the way in which you begin to see an integration in the architecture, the furniture, the wallpaper, the interiors, everything kind of comes together. What's interesting about it, I think, is that it doesn't look so forced, right? Like if later you'll look at probably Frank Lloyd Wright interiors, and Wright designed everything to be sort of super matchy-matchy, and he would even design dresses for the lady of the house to wear so she could match her house. Got kind of horrifying. But this doesn't have that feeling. It doesn't feel like it's overly unified. It's sort of natural in the end. And it could almost be mistaken for being an older vernacular house in the area. Almost. It's a little bit too well done to do that. But of course, the irony of these designs of houses like Morris's is that it's really, really expensive to build like this. And so who can afford handcrafted items in the mid-19th century in England? Only the wealthy upper class. And so the utopian ideals of arts and crafts never really amount to much in that regard. His vision of sort of returning urban dwellers to the villages so that they can return to a moral, good, honest, craftsman-based way of life, it just doesn't work out. But nevertheless, his ideals do sort of influence a lot of people later, and they still, I think, are part of our culture today. Like, you will hear politicians saying things like, that the real Americans are the rural people in small towns, or the heartland, So there is still that sensibility is still part of our culture. Not necessarily that it comes specifically from Morris, but there is this connection between simplicity, rural life, and morality. Another way in which Morris will continue to influence later designers is his idea that everybody should have access to beautiful things, right? That's a pretty novel idea in the mid-19th century, that like an upper class designer would be concerned about what the poor have in terms of furnishings and how they live. That's a new idea. And that's one that we'll see in the 20th century designers will take up again and again and struggle with. So that connection between beauty and morality, and also this connection between architecture, interiors, furnitures, fixtures, lighting design, all of that sort of integration of design at all scales is something that's characteristic of the arts and crafts, and that does have a lot of influence. Let's look at another project. So this is Broadleys, and this is kind of the next generation of architects working in England. So a little bit later, we're talking about the end of the 19th century now. This is Charles Francis Voysey. He's one of the leading architects working in England at this period. And you can see, just first glance at this, he's also inspired by some of the same ideals, particularly vernacular architecture, this idea of sort of returning to tradition. And he designs a number of homes in sort of semi-rural settings like this one. So he's drawing on local building materials and local techniques. And in this case, the house overlooks a lake, which you can kind of get a sense of that here. The exterior, it looks pretty simple. So there's that simplicity and morality coming through. It doesn't have a lot of ornamentation. There are no lavish cornices or colonnades added to it like you might find during this period. It has those steeply pitched roofs, which again tell us we're in a northern climate. And then these chimneys protruding through the roofs at irregular places, right? Like it's not really clear. There's no order in terms of the chimneys, where they come up. It's not always located in the same space relative to the roof. He's also an important one for modernist architects because look at that project. It's white volumes of space. They're stripped of all ornamentation. And this is what, in the early 20th century, modernist architects will latch on to things like this and take it to the next step, which means, in the case of Corbusier, raising it up on pilotis, adding ribbon windows. So this is sort of the first inclination in that direction, to just use stripped down white volumes of space. And what's important about this, or revolutionary, is the lack of historicism. So there aren't even Gothic references here, right? Which is a shift, because most architects at this moment in time, practicing in England, are doing historical revivals. They come to you and say, oh, you're my client. Do you want classical? Do you want Gothic? Do you want French Gothic? Do you want English Gothic? Like, what variety of history would you prefer? So this is a departure from that context. Another thing that's important is on the interiors, you begin to see the free flow of space. And let's look back to, so here in the Red House plan, you still see a lot of corridors connecting spaces, right? As opposed to spaces flowing into one another. You still see the kitchen. To get to the dining room, I have to go out into the hall, and then into the entry hall, and then into the dining room. That's a pretty distinct separation of spaces that one would naturally imagine might want to be more connected than that. So in Boise's, this is one of the examples, and I apologize, I don't have a plan of it, where you begin to see spaces flowing into one another a bit more than previously done, which is also a modern sensibility of space, the open plan. Okay, and I should point out, I don't know if you guys can read this, deep overhang, horizontal windows, white stucco facade, those white volumes that are free of ornament. There's a veranda, and there are bay windows facing the lake, which makes a lot of sense. So that's another way that it's integrated with the site, right? You couldn't turn this building around and have it make a lot of sense. Okay. Here's another example from the late 19th century by Lutens, Edward Lutens. And again, you see the use of local materials, so that brick, steeply pitched roofs, randomly placed chimneys. We're beginning to see some common elements emerging here. The windows also sort of randomly placed. Really, their size and placement is derived from the interior function. And overall, it has that picturesque sensibility, right? It looks like it wasn't that carefully planned, even though that picturesque aesthetic is very carefully orchestrated. So it's this strange thing where it's designed to look like it's not actually designed, in a sense. And it gives it this sort of informal character, but it's also quite dignified, I think, in this case. And in Lutens actually exaggerated the chimneys here to really emphasize function, right? That this house is sort of semi-utilitarian, that the chimney is, I mean, almost like a smokestack, you know? Let's look inside this one. So, the interior, this is the second floor hall of the orchards. And you can see he's using a heavy timber structure, which makes sense, again, because you have trees in England. If you went to Italy, you wouldn't have heavy timber because they're just they just don't have the same kind of lumber and accessibility to it. You have a lot of wood paneling, wood flooring. These are all traditional English architectural elements. And you could also look at this and get a sense of there's still something medieval about this, right? It's not a grand scale. The ways in which the timber structure sort of die into the wall looks a little bit unplanned, has a medieval sensibility to it, I think. And then he's got all of this beautiful wood paneling, right? And cabinetry designed into the room, which is very common in arts and crafts. Let's look at another later example. So this is 1906 in the Hampstead Garden suburb in London. This is Parker and Unwin, another kind of famous pair of architects. So what do we see again? We see a lot of chimneys, steep roofs, white unornamented volumes of space that have a bit of a random character to them. We see an integration with the landscape here, that random window placement. So these are kind of our repeating characteristics that we can find in any one of these arts and crafts houses. You also see the arched openings, which are a symbol of shelter and refuge. You see this deep overhang, which is to give it kind of a protective quality, right? The house is sort of a source of protection. And this has kind of a heavy and grounded character, which many of these houses do. So it is really directly connected to the earth and to nature. It is not raised up on a podium, it's not raised up on pilotis. It appears almost as if it grows out of the ground. So, interiors of arts and crafts. As I mentioned before, it is usually unified in terms of the architecture interiors, but not overly, not heavy-handed, right? So there's still a sense of informality that you see on the exterior, you see that on the interior, and in the way the two come together. So you have free-flowing space beginning to emerge. You still have a lot of sort of hallways separating rooms. You have plans that tend to be functionally derived. Rows of windows, you have rough textures, naturalistic color schemes and patterns, and we'll see more of those, I think, with Morris. Built-in furniture. It seems like what's very typical in interiors and arts and crafts is for a lot of the furniture to be built in and then a few pieces to stand out, right, that are not built in. Some special pieces. Again, derived from vernacular and medieval. Often have ingle nooks, fireplaces, stairs. So a lot of these have sort of a cozy, warm sensibility on the interior. Okay, so here's an example. This is the Orchards by Voisey. And you can look at this interior and see, let's see, it has that sense of carefully orchestrated informality. It feels almost like it's not necessarily designed by one of the leading architects of the day, right? So Voisey's ideas of simplicity and honesty and sort of plainness, and he's also interested in creating spaces that are easy to clean. This is how that gets translated on the interior. And I think we have a color image of this, so I'm going to go to that. So this is an interpretation of what that probably looked like in color, and another looking into the dining hall in that room. So what do you see? You see purples, greens, yellows, kind of warm pastels and natural colors. So like the greens and reds, browns, things that you might find in nature, right? And there's little ornament here. So this is a clock that Voisey designed, and it has a little, added something to it. But when you look at the whole room and you imagine comparing it to, say, a Victorian interior, where everything is sort of overstuffed and lacy and overdone, this is far more restrained and simple. A lot less ornament here. Let's look at the floor plans of this house. So here you can begin to see again how, there are fewer hallways separating rooms. But there is still a separation of spaces, right? They haven't gone to free planning yet. And you can also see how these public rooms are centered around the hearth there. And that the hearth for the arts and crafts designers is really a symbol of the home and of family. And they would often put mottos or proverbs up on the walls on a frieze. Let's look at another image of an interior. So this is from a magazine, a watercolor rendering of an interior. And you can see there's like this little nook right around the fireplace. There's all of this wood cabinetry built in, which is pretty simple, but has some organic, nature-inspired decoration up there at the top. You see the color palette that they're using, warm pastels, natural colors. Let's see. And that gets carried often into the ceramic tiles around the fireplaces, which you can't really see here. The table is pretty simple, right? It's just a plain flat wood piece with a trestle table, trestle bottom to it. So it's kind of cozy, warm, nature-inspired interiors. Okay, here's our Morris textile designs, finally. So you can see there is a sense of symmetry, regularity. There are repeating elements to these textile designs, especially if we saw like a bigger swatch of them. But they're very much derived from nature. And you can also see, I think, in these, where the color palette for some of those interiors that we saw is coming from, right? So we saw similar colors, greens and browns, lavender, pink, sort of soft, subtle colors in most cases with some accents in the top. And Morris was very much inspired by Japanese designs and motifs as well as nature, you can see really clearly. Let's look at some light fixtures. So these, you can see they're not overly ornamented, but I think they give you a good sense of the variety of designs that could be included under the umbrella of arts and crafts. So like this first one is very much, it's a candlestick. It's very much derived from natural forms. And I think we could almost classify it as Art Nouveau, which we'll get to on Thursday. But it looks plant-like, right? It looks almost like it's an organic plant form turned into a candlestick. These two are far more simple and functional. They have bits of maybe natural inspired ornament here or here, but for the most part, they're functional. But notice even the curve here. That's a little something more than, say, the more straightforward curves of this fixture. So that kind of gives you a sense of the range. Like, there are very simple designs that could be characterized as arts and crafts, as well as more ornamented pieces. But they all have some sense of functionality and simplicity. So, furnishings and the decorative arts. The ideals that we find in architecture and interiors are continued into this realm. The source of inspiration from vernacular architecture, from local traditional building traditions, materials, are all continued into the realm of the furniture and decorative arts. They are human scale, inspired by the vernacular. Often, this fourth bullet point, plain, simple, rectangular, and rustic, or, to be totally different than that, refined, sinuous lines, complicated inlay, carving, painted decorations. So in terms of furnishings and decorative arts, we're going to get a much wider variation here, right? So you could have really simple stuff, you could have complicated, highly designed, handcrafted things. And these are typically being produced in small furniture making shops like Morris's and elsewhere by designers. So here's some examples of chairs. So you can see in both cases, like the overall sensibility is one derived from function, right? These are pretty simple, straightforward, handcrafted chairs. The armchair that you see on the right is actually derived from a traditional English form of armchair. but it's adapted in this case, so it has these spindles, which are a little bit more ornate, and it has these padded arms, which you might not have found previously. And then it has this fabric, which you can see, the upholstery, is very much in keeping with those Morris textile designs, right? That it's natural, but somewhat regular. And it has a cushioned seat and an adjustable back. And that makes it a pretty good chair. So the one on the right is actually pretty widely copied after this. And you can see the one on the left is a little bit more straightforward, simple, kind of has that rustic sensibility that I mentioned earlier that shows up in some of these designs. This is a settee, it's not a settle. There are a lot of misspellings in these PowerPoints. It's a settee. And that is maybe what we would call a medieval couch. So these get reintroduced as part of this goal of sort of reintroducing medieval culture or ideals. We see medieval settees. And those are reintroduced as part of this agenda of like enforcing the aesthetics of the arts and crafts style. And you can see it's primarily constructed of wood. It's got a nice cushion across it, and it's highly, highly ornate in this case, which that image is not great, but maybe you can see it better on your own computers, I think. And these actually became popular in the American arts and crafts movement as well, which we're not going to talk about, but you should be aware of. There is an American variant. Here's another, a desk designed by Voisey, who designed some of the houses we just looked at. So you see that simplicity derived mainly from functional concerns, but with a little bit of nature-inspired ornamentation and that sense of handcrafting. That like I'm not going to walk into my neighbor's house and see the exact same desk, right? Because there's something individual and personal that the artist created just for me and my desk in this case. It's also intended to blend in with the architecture, right? So it's supposed to be a holistic style. If you live in the arts and crafts way, your desk matches your house, matches your carpet, matches everything else, but not overly matching. And it is, like I said before, you'd have a lot of built-in furniture and then a few select kind of pieces like this. Here's another example, which is way more ornate, but gives you a sense of the range that we're talking about here. So from the very simple with minimal decoration to the sort of very complex with a lot of decoration, right, in this wardrobe. And that kind of makes sense because if you only have sort of 5 showpieces of furniture, you might want one to be really fabulous like this, in a public space, to really kind of draw attention to it, because everything else might be built in and sort of background, if you will. Let's look at Morris's bed here. So this is his bedroom, and this is actually an antique bed, right? It's not, he didn't design it or anything, it's from the 17th century, but it gives you a sense of what he was after, right? How did he himself live? This is a good indication of that. So he's actually mixing in an antique bed with contemporary bed hangings, which are embroidered, and embroidery is something that comes back into vogue full force during this period. And you can understand why, because it's part of that arts and crafts sensibility, is that what is really meaningful to me is if you embroider me something by hand and it takes you hours and hours and hours of labor. That's sort of a better product than one industrially produced for these guys. So an embroidery is one of the most labor-intensive things you could do, so they love it. And these are embroidered bed hangings using natural dyes. You can see that same sort of ornamental sensibility in terms of the pattern being inspired by nature, the colors being inspired by nature, and contrasted with that heavy, dark, antique bed. So a few more objects here. On the left, you have a decorative clock. And things like this are very popular. And on the right, you have a decanter. And again, you're seeing the range of style within the arts and crafts umbrella. So this is sort of geometric, relatively simple, but it has this painted bit, which makes it a little bit more ornamented. Those warm kind of natural colors with a bit of blue here. And then here you have something that is leaning more towards Art Nouveau, which we'll talk about on Thursday. So really organically inspired forms, plant-like forms, that's really common in Art Nouveau. But that really starts with the arts and crafts. So that kind of gives you a sense of the wide range of stuff that you would see as part of arts and crafts. Other things they do, they embrace handmade ceramics, glass, woodwork, metalwork. All of these are taken up again as sort of handcrafts during this period. They embrace bookbinding, which all of these things, it's interesting. It's at the exact moment that things are beginning to be industrially produced. These guys are saying, no, preserve the craft. You know, we're going to lose our sensibility. We're going to lose who we are if we don't preserve the ability to make all of these things by hand, which can now be industrially produced. Bookbinding, they take up knitting again, lacework, and regional crafts, which vary from place to place. And this re-embrace of crafts is really seen as a means to social and moral reform. So if they reflect that desire to get the urban poor back out of the city to a more natural and honest life in villages by engaging them in hand labor as opposed to industrial production. So that's sort of the agenda at work here. And I think that's our last slide. So do you guys have any questions? All right. And I guess I'll see you on Thursday. I kind of talk fast, and I should tell you, you can raise your hand at any time if I'm talking too fast. But I also recorded this, so